the T15. So the T15 is a guitar that was developed after the T60. We're into the 80s now. I believe it's 1983. Sometime in the early 80s, either 82 or 83. Hard to find an exact date on the T15, but this is a student model that is in the very similar vein to the T60. We still have a swamp ash body, the bilaminate maple neck made of hard rock maple, and we have a much shorter scale length with this guitar. It's a 23.5 inch scale length. So again, you think student model, this is maybe built for someone younger, so a smaller person. It's a smaller guitar, it's lighter, so you don't have to worry about all that heft, and it's just pretty simple. The original T15s were spec'd with Peavey super ferrite single coil pickups, and these pickups kind of get a lot of heat for not being that great. I don't know, they're single coils, so they don't have too much tonal variety, but they're high output and a very unique kind of blade style design. They are a humbucker sized pickup, so it wasn't uncommon for these pickups to be swapped out for like a Seymour Duncan or just some other humbucking style pickup. But that really takes away from the ethos of the guitar, which is a student model. It's not meant to be played super loud. It's not meant to be a rocker. It's something to help you learn the instrument, get familiar with it, to give you a really inexpensive platform that is really high quality as well. The T15 was also sold with a rotomolded guitar case, which is a plastic case. Most of the Peavey, or if not all of the Peavey guitars at this point, come with this rotomolded case. But what makes the T15 unique is that it's the first time we see the built-in amp case. And it's a 10-watt solid-state amp that sits right in a spot in that rotomolded case. And you could plug it into the wall, plug your guitar into the case, and you have a full sound making capacity. 10 watts obviously doesn't make a lot of noise, but it makes enough to practice and, you know, keep it in your bedroom, keep it in your dorm room, wherever, and you can whip it out and still have a pretty satisfying experience. These guitars, being a shorter scale length, have 20 frets. So that's one of the first times we see 20 frets on a Peavey guitar. Okay, so far, these are all instruments that I no longer own. I've either traded or sold or whatever, you know, things happen and instruments have to go down the river. And it's always sad for me to see a Peavey guitar or amp leave just because I love them so much, but you can only have so much stuff. But we now get into some of the gear that I have currently and we're going to use throughout the duration of this video for demo purposes. We're going to talk about another amplifier from Peavey. This is the Peavey Encore 65, and this is the amp sitting directly to my right. This is a full tube amp. We don't have a solid state rectifier or preamp or anything. We have two 6L6s with one 12AX7 kind of driving the system. It's not in the preamp, although our preamp does have two 12AX7s. So in essence, there's three 12AX7s. And then we also have a 12AT7 that's powering the reverb and the mixer on this amplifier. So all tube, all day long, and boy does this thing rip. This is a single 12-inch combo amplifier. It comes loaded with a Scorpion, a Peavey Scorpion speaker. The Peavey Scorpion speaker is one that's going to show up quite a bit in this video, so let's take a quick look at it before we get into this amplifier. This is the Peavey Scorpion. It's a 12-inch guitar driver. Very unique in that it kind of has a square outline. It's not perfectly circular, so you can pretty much instantly recognize when a Peavey amp has a Scorpion in it because this surround is very recognizable. This is like a early 80s Peavey Scorpion speaker, and it's got a ton of wattage. I believe they're 200 watts or something like that. But they're made in USA by Peavey. This isn't an Eminence off-brand kind of throw in their speaker. This is specifically designed for their equipment, and that's the speaker that's loaded in this amplifier and quite a few that we'll talk about in the future. So you'll see the number 65 in the name. It says Vintage Tube Series Encore 65. Let's just take apart that for 1 second. Vintage Tube Series. This is an amplifier that is trying to emulate some vintage style amplifiers. In this case, the vintage amplifiers would be from the 50s and 60s. So early Fenders, early Gibsons, early Gretsch, early Rickenbacker amps that, you know, nobody even knows about anymore. That's what this is trying to emulate, and I don't think it does a very good job because it really doesn't sound that vintage. It sounds more modern to me than vintage, but that's what they call it, Vintage Tube Series Encore 65. The Encore name, I don't think they use that branding ever again. I've never seen another Encore product from Peavey, so I think this is the only Encore that they ever came out with. 65 means that it's a 65 watt power tube amplifier. Our enclosure is made of 3/4 inch hardwood plywood, so really sturdy. This thing is gonna take a licking and keep on ticking, as it were. We have the silver drip edge on the side. This is very characteristic of the late 70s, early 80s for Peavey products, and it looks great. It's just a badass looking amp. This particular amp has a 2-channel foot switch. So 2 channels on the amplifier, a clean and a dirty. Something that's being developed in this time, not just a single channel where you have a bunch of pedals that you have to get that dirty sound. It's actually built right into the amp. There is an auxiliary out on the back, just a 1/4 inch out, that allows you to connect to an external cabinet. And I've had this thing plugged into this 4x12 cabinet, and it sounds raucous. It is badass. There's a high gain and a low gain input. It's kind of gimmicky, but for the most part, I just leave it in the high gain and call it good. This amplifier also has a reverb, and it's a built-in tank reverb, just like in the Classic, and just has a nice dial that controls the reverb. I leave it pretty low just to add a little bit of echo in there, but it's always nice to have a built-in reverb. And the other unique aspect of this amplifier are the push-pull dials. So instead of having 2 sets of dials, we can basically just pull it out and get a different tonal variety. And what it says is pull bright. So it brightens up the sound, gets you a little more headroom when you pull it out. That's the pre-dial. And then the post-dial, if you pull it out, it smooths it out. Just, you know, marketing words that they use to describe sound variations. But that's for the post and that's for the pre. The rest of them are just regular style potentiometers that do not pull, but that's kind of cool, having some push-pull dials on an old 80s amplifier. So we'll hear this amplifier in just 1 second, but first I want to talk about the next 80s Peavey instrument that I've acquired. This is the Peavey Patriot. So the Peavey Patriot, what is this guitar? This is a pretty light, small feeling guitar, and it's not quite a student model like the T15, although it is a shorter scale length. We do have a 23 3/4 inch scale length on this guitar. Bizarre, I know, right? It's not like any other scale length that I've ever felt. It's shorter than a Gibson, obviously shorter than a Fender, longer than the T15, so it's kind of in between. But other than that, this is a pretty stripped down, bare bones guitar. 2 of the Peavey Super Ferrite blade style pickups, just like in the T15, and a 3-way switch right here, and 2 knobs. That's it, volume, tone. And you can have the bridge pickup, the neck pickup, or the middle, just like in a Gibson, but it's very simple. Our bridge does not have a tremolo option, just 2 bolts right on the mahogany body. Our neck is, again, our bilaminate maple, the Hard Rock maple 2-sided neck, and it's just really, really rock solid. The neck is glossy, very glossy, nice lacquer on it, feels good. This particular body, this mahogany body, I've refinished because when I got this guitar, it looked terrible. I don't know how to explain it other than it just looked dry. It was not the smoothest guitar. It was just dry looking and feeling. So I sanded it and hit it with about 9 coats of tung oil, and it looks great, feels great. It's smooth now, and it makes me want to play it a lot more. This guitar has an odd number of frets as well. We're back to 23 frets here. So we had 21 on the T60, we had 20 on the T15. Now we're up to 23, okay? Don't get it, but I don't really mind too much because, again, this guitar is not meant to be played way up here. This is a beginner's guitar or a rhythm guitar, something that's not going to be required to punch too far out of the mix, because these single coil super ferrite pickups, they're just not the most present pickup. And let's go ahead and hear this guitar through the Encore 65 and kind of get a tonal sample of both. Also worth mentioning are the tuners on this guitar. These are these cheapo Peavey kind of 6-in-line Kluson Deluxe style tuners with the buttons. I hate these tuners. If I were to be gigging with this guitar, I would swap these tuners out. Absolutely, no questions asked. But right now, they're not too terrible. All right, let's hear what this thing sounds like. That's our bridge. Here's our neck. They're very clear pickups, very bright. Single coils without too much hum. I think that however they manufacture these, they do a good job of eliminating hum. So this is what this guitar sounds like. And that's the clean channel on this amplifier. I have the pre set to 3. The pump set to 7, which isn't coming into play at this point. In the clean channel, the pump or gain is totally out of the circuit. That only gets engaged when you get into the lead channel. And then otherwise, we have a 3-band EQ, low, middle, high. And actually, I forgot, there's a pull on this one too for thick. So it thickens up the sound a little bit. And then our reverb and presence dial. The presence is just kind of like a treble cut or treble boost, depending on which way you go. If you raise it up, it tends to add a bit more treble. Like it right around 7. So that's the clean channel. Let's go ahead and kick it into the dirty channel. Interesting, this guitar does not pair well with heavy high gain activity, so a lot of the deficiencies that you're hearing are from this guitar. A lot of them are also from the Scorpion speaker. I actually swapped this Scorpion speaker out for an Eminence muscle magnet speaker, which is a bit heavier, a bit more modern, and I find that it handles the heavy stuff a little bit better. But we're gonna hear this amp a little bit better with a humbucker or modern guitar shortly, but I just wanted to use this as our platform for the purposes of this all Peavey all the time demo. We also have another amplifier that we'll get in the mix shortly, but for now, we'll be rocking the Encore 65. So let's leave it at that for now with the Peavey Patriot. This is just a really great guitar. You can find these used for under $400. Sometimes they're heavily modified because, again, our pickups are humbucker sized, so you could get a humbucker in here and change the whole spirit of this guitar. But I love the original sounds. Even if it's not that versatile, it's cool to hear what these things sound like. Okay, the next thing I want to mention is the 4x12, just Peavey 4x12 cabinet. It doesn't have a real good name. I don't think that they named these cabinets other than just 4x12 or 2x12 or whatever variants they had. And this is another silver drip style instrument or cabinet, and it comes from the same era as the Peavey Encore 65. The 4x12 cabinet was also loaded with 4 Scorpion speakers, so that speaker was really heavily utilized by Peavey at this time. This was an interesting cabinet. It had 2 separate compartments. The top and the bottom are basically 2 2x12s stacked on one another and wired into one jack. So the top half and the lower half are separated, and that does affect how the air moves inside and interacts with the speaker cones and your instrument, your guitar and amplifier. So the Peavey 4x12 cabinet also utilized 3/4 inch hard plywood, so a really nice hard enclosure. Makes it super, super heavy and harder than hell to move, but they are rock solid and you can probably never destroy these things. These cabinets had heavy duty corners and handles, and some I believe came factory with casters, but the one that I had did not have casters, so it was just lug and plug. Okay, let's talk about another amp. An amp from the 80s called the Studio Pro 50 by Peavey. Now the Studio Pro line of amplifiers has a few different variants. There's a 40 watt, I believe there's a 60 watt. The Studio Pro line is a solid state line of amplifiers, just pure solid state transistor, no tubes whatsoever. This is also a 1x12 inch combo amplifier, so similar to the Encore 65 in form factor, but a little smaller. The amplifier portion doesn't need as much space, so they kind of shaved it down a little bit, and it's also therefore meant to be more of a studio or practice amplifier. You definitely can use this amplifier at a gig of, a certain size. You're not going to be playing Wembley Stadium with the Studio Pro 50, but most clubs or anything less than 300 or 400 seats, you could probably get away with this single amp. Even having it dimed, it still sounds really good. The one thing that I would recommend with this line of amps is swapping out the speaker, because it did come with kind of a cheaper, no brand eminent speaker. So there's just nothing to tell what it is other than a few date codes printed on the cone. So that's something to keep in mind. The original speaker is a little underwhelming, leaves a little bit to be desired. But if you put a V30 in there or some other Celestion speaker, it instantly raises the quality of that amp, and it actually makes it a little bit louder too, because those old eminent speakers, they don't have as much oomph as your modern Celestion rock speakers. But the Studio Pro line and the Peavey Bandit are 2 solid state amps that you see even today. They fetch a pretty high price because people really love them. They're high quality, they just sound good no matter what area you're in, and they sound clean. They don't have a bunch of noise in them. The solid state technology just really holds up. Let's hear a little bit of the Peavey Studio Pro 50 from a previous video. Okay, let's go back to another guitar. This is a guitar that actually lives at my mom's house. This is what I call my New York guitar. I keep it at my mom's house for when we go back and visit and have an electric guitar to play. But the Peavey Horizon 2 is really Peavey's kind of first foray into the super strat realm. It's not what you'd call a full-on super strat. It doesn't have a Floyd Rose or Kahler tremolo, but it does have an available adjustable Peavey tremolo, and it's just one that they developed and branded themselves, and it works fine. With the Horizon series, you get a bit more wilder colors, a bit more boldness. Think about the T series that we've talked about so far and the Patriot. pretty bland as far as just natural wood colors, and you can find black and sunburst in those guitars, but for the most part, I personally associate those guitars with natural swamp ash, which is a beautiful wood, but just not as exciting as, say, a neon pink or something like that. So these Horizon 2 guitars are an HSH humbucker single coil humbucker pickup configuration. So that's a little more modern. Super Strat, we have the bridge humbucker, and you still get the option to have that single coil in the middle, but it's becoming to be a bit more modern of a guitar with colors. The shape is a bit more pointy. They kind of offset things a little bit and make the horns a little longer. So they're not just trying to rip off a Fender Stratocaster and make it their own. It's kind of a unique body shape and a unique sounding guitar. If you try to find out what these guitars are made of, it's kind of hard. It's not all apparent, but it does look like alder was one of the woods that they used for this particular guitar, and that makes sense. Alder is usually a wood that gets painted over historically, but a very classic tone wood for the body of a guitar. We also have the familiar bilaminate hard rock maple neck, so no departures there, and I do believe we have the same maple and rosewood fretboard options. The Horizon 2 has a very interesting, very Gibson-esque 24 3/4 inch scale length. So I don't know if that was trying to go after a specific guitar or market, but it's a little shorter than your Fender scale length, longer than the Patriot scale length. So, but a more standard scale length with 24 frets. So that's the first Peavey guitar with 24 frets, full 2 octaves. There is a hardtail version, but as I mentioned, there is one with an available tremolo as well. Okay, next, very similarly to the Horizon 2, we have the Vortex, which is a shredder's guitar. This is very firmly aimed at the 80s shredders, the hard rock that was popular in the mid-80s, and the Vortex is kind of a modern take on 2 Gibson guitars. We have the Vortex 1, which is a slightly pointier, more askew Explorer, and then we have the Vortex 2, which is the Flying V, which is, again, slightly offset, slightly pointier than a Gibson Flying V, a little more modern as far as shape and what it's meant to do. These guitars come stock with a Kahler tremolo, so we're finally into the world of shredder where we have an honest-to-God tremolo on there. Again, not a Floyd Rose, but the Kahler is pretty respected at this time, and I think that they fit well with the Peavey line just because they're a bit smaller, and these guitars tend to have smaller bodies just because the points are kind of out there and they don't want you to have a big old Medusa of a guitar. The literature for these guitars, again, says select hardwoods for the body, maybe alder, I don't know. Could be maple as well. This one was a little heavier, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually maple. But again, we do have the same bilaminate hard rock maple neck as you find on all Peavey guitars of this era. One interesting thing to note, we get our first kind of normal looking humbuckers. These are called the P12 adjustable pole piece humbucking pickups, and each pole piece is adjustable via Allen wrench, and that's kind of cool. You can really tailor how hot you want each string to be on your guitar. I think for the most part, people are going to set it and forget it, but it's nice to have that adjustability on the P12 humbucking pickup. Now, in opposition to the Horizon 2, the Vortex line of guitars has a 25.5-inch scale length. So for whatever reason, we have Gibson-esque shapes with Fender-esque scale length. And maybe that's just to accommodate the shape of the guitar, but 25.5-inch scale length. We do not get the full 24 frets though, we only go 22. So again, back to Gibson Fender land, I don't know, maybe they weren't trying to rock the boat too hard, but we have 22 frets on these guitars with the Kahler tremolo. Again, we do have the simple 2-knob layout, 1 volume, 1 tone. That's all you need. I wish all guitars were like that. And then one other spec to note is a Graflon nut, which I think a lot of these Peavey guitars from kind of this period onward use the Graflon nut. It's not bone, but it really acts like bone, and it's a high quality synthetic material. So the next guitar I want to talk about is the Peavey Mystic. And this is right in line with the Horizon and Vortex. I really love this era of Peavey guitars because they were thinking outside of the box. They were coming up with unique shapes, unique humbucker pickup layouts, unique everything, and really trying to break the mold of what a modern guitar should be. And they were doing it at a much lower price point than your comparable Fenders or Gibsons of the time, which both Fender and Gibson in the mid 80s were going through management change. They were acquired by obviously different outfits, but they went from being Norlin owned Gibson and CBS owning Fender to more private companies that were monitoring the manufacturing process a lot more closely. And as a result, this is kind of the beginning of returning to form for both Fender and Gibson. And it took companies like Peavey, companies like PRS in 1985, pushing them to say, you know what? You're not the top dogs anymore. You got to really elevate your game. And that brought the whole industry up. And Peavey kind of gets lost in the shuffle towards the end of the 90s, but they're in there that whole 2-decade period from the 80s through the 90s, really shaking things up and making Fender, Gibson, and the other big guys real nervous. So the Mystic, similar in layout to the Horizon. It's very similar electronics. We also have a 24 and 3/4 inch scale length again on the Mystic. So there's very little continuity when it comes to scale length. I guess each guitar was designed for its specific purposes, and that's just that. But the Mystic is one of the crazier shapes that you'll see from Peavey. There's the Mystic and the Razor, which are just bizarre. They're pointy, they're angular, and they scream 80s. We get crazy colors, we get just unique guitars with no bullshit. Again, we have the select hard woods as far as the body goes, probably alder, maybe maple, hard to say. Our necks are the same bilaminate hard rock maple, so that stays consistent through all of the models. And then this guitar also has 23 frets. Another weird spec for you. And being kind of a shredder guitar, you would expect this guitar to be spec'd from factory with a tremolo, but that's not the case. It's an available tremolo, and I believe it was a Peavey branded, potentially a Kahler if you wanted to upgrade. But again, that kind of documentation is hard to find. You would have also expected to see those same P12 adjustable pole piece humbuckers in this guitar, but that's not the case. We do get the blade style super ferrite pickups again. They are in the humbucking variety. They're 2 blades, but it's still kind of in the same wheelhouse as that super ferrite single blade style pickup from like the Peavey Patriot and the T15. The Mystic is such a cool guitar, one that doesn't come up for sale that often, but when they do, they tend to be quick and people pick them up because they have a certain kind of vibe. Okay, the last piece of gear that I want to talk about in the 1980s that I've owned personally is the Peavey Backstage Plus 35. I think it might actually just be the Peavey Backstage Plus, but it is a 35 watt solid state amp. So this is kind of in line with that Studio Pro 50, where we have 100% solid state preamp, power amp, all transistor powered. So solid state across the board. But this is more of a dedicated practice amp. It is a 112, a 1x12 combo amp, but it's even smaller than the Studio Pro 50. So it's the smallest form factor that you can imagine to fit a 12-inch speaker and a solid state amp in there. The Backstage Plus did have a preamp out option, which allows you to utilize that solid state preamp in a different amplified situation. So that's kind of cool. These amps really do pack in a lot of features. They're not just a small little amp that you have one input. You can really patch them into a lot of different effects, patch them into a PA, you name it. They're very versatile and they can really pack a big punch. Another unique feature of this amp is the headphone jack was right on the front of it. So it's kind of, again, designed for practice, for studio, so that you can plug in through the headphones, still get a very quality experience without killing your neighbors or your housemates, whomever. And finally, one interesting spec that's called out in the literature for the Backstage Plus is what they call gain block gain staging. And it has to do with turning the knobs and introducing certain amount of gain. And as a result, you can achieve certain sounds, either like a rock sound or a jazz sound or anything in between, by adjusting just the knobs, which affects the gain in the channel. I actually have never seen this gain block, gain staging mentioned on any other Peavey literature, so if you have a little more information on it, I'd love to know more. I'd love to learn. Okay, so that's obviously not all of the products that exist for Peavey in the 80s, but those are all the ones from the 80s that I've encountered. Quite a few of them because I really do love that era. But we're going to move into the 90s, which again, a really great era for Peavey. This is when we see a partnership with Eddie Van Halen and some other really important artists, and Peavey starts to jump into that kind of high-end musical instrument manufacturer, and they're still fully manufactured in the US, and they're growing. This is still a growing company. All right, so that does it for the 1980s with regards to all of the Peavey gear that I have owned. Stay tuned for part 3 because we get into the 90s where we discuss Eddie Van Halen's affiliation with Peavey and talk about some really cool gear as well. Let me know if you have any questions or experience with any of this gear, and I'd be glad to answer them in the comments below. Otherwise, like and subscribe if you like this content, and I will see you on the next one.